are you today? As you know, I love books, I love good stories, and I love sharing them with you. And I have a great one today. It's called Cranberry Christmas. It's written by Wende and Harry Devlin. Wende Devlin wrote the story, and her husband Harry did the illustrations, which I just love. And if you saw Cranberry Thanksgiving, that was one of my favorite Thanksgiving stories. Well, this one is Cranberry Christmas. So I hope you like it as much as I do. Let's get started. Look at Mr. Whiskers. He doesn't look happy, does he? Christmas was coming. Snow was on the cranberry bog, the smell of pine in the wind, and the fresh water pond frozen smooth. Mr. Whiskers, looking out from his kitchen window, was deep in gloom. Christmas was only 3 days away, and his pond should have been filled with skaters. Skaters in bright sweaters, laughing with their scarves flying in the wind. And he should have been there teaching them all to twirl and do figure eights. But old Cyrus Grape had changed all that. He had moved in next door to Mr. Whiskers into the stone house on the rise and claimed that the pond was on his land. Cyrus didn't like children. Whenever he saw them on the pond, he would hop on his sled and slide bumpity-bump down the hill. "Scat! Off my pond or I'll have the sheriff after you!" Cyrus would shout as he shook his cane and chased the skaters to the snowy banks. "It's my pond, you old scoundrel! Mine!" Mr. Whiskers would boom back. But when the old sea captain searched through the attic, his desk, and the cellar of his little gray cottage, he could find nothing to prove that he owned the pond. He began to wonder if he did own the pond. Kind of messy. Mr. Whiskers brooded. Cyrus Grape cackled. And the little children sadly hung up their skates. Today, there were new troubles for Mr. Whiskers. A letter from his persnickety sister Sarah in the city announced that she was coming for Christmas, and after the holidays, she expected him to come back to the city and live with her. "You can't take care of yourself. Your house looks like a shipwreck, and your money box is always empty," she scolded in her letter. Mr. Whiskers frowned. He liked the way he took care of himself. In the summer, he clammed and felt the water and sand on his bare feet. In the winter, he ice skated with the children all around him like a school of fish. To think of leaving Cranberryport? The idea of living in the city with Sis Sarah and her striped cat made Mr. Whiskers furious. Fuming, he took his troubles to Maggie and her grandmother, who lived in a farmhouse on the other side of the dunes. "Suffering codfish! What can I do?" He waved the letter in their kitchen. When grandmother heard Mr. Whiskers' news, she held her head. "A guest at Mr. Whiskers' jumbled house? You haven't borrowed my broom since summer," she chided. "I sweep in the spring," Mr. Whiskers said, looking at the ceiling. Grandmother shook her head. She and Maggie didn't waste time. Mr. Whiskers certainly needed help. In a few minutes, loaded with grandmother's soap and polish and bristling with brooms and brushes, all three took the path to Mr. Whiskers' house over the dunes on the ocean side. They went to work. How they worked! Maggie washed the windows. Mr. Whiskers scrubbed the floors. Grandmother dusted and gave orders. "What's behind this couch?" "Lobster pots," Mr. Whiskers answered. "What's in the bathtub?" "My shell collection," growled Mr. Whiskers. Out with them all, ordered Grandmother. Mr. Whiskers grumbled about persnickety sisters and certain grandmothers, but he did as he was told. It was at the end of the second day of helping Mr. Whiskers that the accident happened. Maggie had trimmed the pine tree and baked her favorite cranberry cookies. She had just put the last pan away when she heard a loud crash in the pantry. Suddenly, there were Mr. Whiskers' feet sticking right through the ceiling. Uh-oh. Maggie raced upstairs. Poor Mr. Whiskers. With help from Maggie, he groaned and pulled himself up. It was then that Maggie spied the dusty black and gold box between the floor and the ceiling. Carefully, they pulled it into the light. "A treasure, Mr. Whiskers," said Maggie with shining eyes. "Not in my house," sighed Mr. Whiskers as he carried the box downstairs. He was right. It was filled with photographs and dusty old papers. But long after Maggie left, Mr. Whiskers was still studying the papers in the orange light of the afternoon. He opened the last stiff parchment and began to smile. Now he chuckled. Then he slapped his knee and shouted, "Suffering codfish!" Christmas Eve brought a light snow to Cranberry Port, and the smell of sea was in the air. Mr. Whiskers' sister Sarah, a round, brown-eyed woman with a flowered bag, arrived from the train station in Cranberry Port's only taxicab. Mr. Whiskers hugged her and introduced Sarah all around. She turned and stared at the cottage. "How clean your windows are, brother." "I love to shine the blinking things," he boomed. Grandmother sniffed and Maggie laughed. But when Sarah went inside the cottage, she could scarcely believe her eyes. She had never seen such a beautiful sight. The wooden table was polished and set with holly and red candles. And the Christmas tree, it was a celebration of seashells. There had been no money for ornaments, so Maggie and Mr. Whiskers had painted the shell collection. It glistened with silver and gold. There were chains of snail shells, silver clam shells, and a golden starfish at the top. Sarah clapped her hands. "Oh, brother, you're a wonder!" Mr. Whiskers smiled behind his whiskers. The night was a triumph. From the supper of clam chowder, Grandmother's famous bread, hot spice cider, and Maggie's cranberry cookies, to the singing of carols around the old piano. Mr. Whiskers pretended to cover his ears when Grandmother trilled on the high notes. And then there were the gifts from the old sea captain, a sea-worn bottle, blue as sapphire for Grandmother, a giant pink shell for Maggie, and a small ivory box for Sarah. Sarah dipped into her flowered bag and presented her brother with a new red knitted scarf and mittens. It was midnight. As Maggie left, Mr. Whiskers whispered into her ear that the children of Cranberry Port should be at the pond at noon tomorrow. He winked in the most mysterious way. See, they're leaving. Christmas afternoon was cold and bright. Mr. Whiskers darted among the skaters and had just stopped to catch his breath when he heard the voice of Cyrus Grape. "Arrest them all, Sheriff!" Behind Cyrus stood a tall man with a broad-brimmed cap. There were screams as the skaters fled in every direction, all except Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Whiskers pretended he hadn't heard a thing. He skated, he whirled, and then he stretched his arms and glided like a great black whiskered bird. Mr. Grape's face grew red. "Off to jail with you," Cyrus screeched, pulling the sheriff after Mr. Whiskers. "I'm skating on my own pond, you old fraud," cried Mr. Whiskers, turning and slowing down until he faced Cyrus Grape. Slowly, triumphantly, he reached into the pocket of his brass-buttoned coat and drew out a yellowed, red-sealed paper and waved it under Cyrus Grape's long nose. He handed it to the sheriff. The sheriff studied it carefully and looked at Mr. Grape. "This paper proves that the pond belongs to Mr. Whiskers," he said. "You, sir, are trespassing on Mr. Whiskers' pond." Cyrus Grape turned a deeper red and roared with rage. He wound his muffler around his face and started up the rise to his house, pulling his sled behind him. Mr. Whiskers turned to the children and raised his hand for silence. "My pond is yours to skate on whenever you'd like. Merry Christmas to everyone." The crowd cheered. Yay! Sarah whispered to him, "My goodness, you certainly can take care of yourself and all of Cranberryport too." Mr. Whiskers offered his arm to Maggie for a turn on the ice. They skated off joyfully. "I'm a wonder," he said to Maggie, and even the Whiskers couldn't hide the smile on Mr. Whiskers' face. Isn't that a great story? And look, at the back of the book is a recipe for Maggie's favorite cranberry cookies. So if you have the book, you can make the cookies too. I hope you liked the story, and I hope you're having a great day. See you soon, friends. Bye now.